Well, I've just decided to change the speech I was going to give in these senator statements after hearing Senator Polley. As the Shadow Minister for Education, we have been prosecuting from day one the importance of evidence-based teaching in every classroom. And I say to Senator Polley, shame on you, Senator Polley, for any suggestion that you have just made that there would be any cuts to school funding under a future Dutton Liberal government. This is palpably untrue. And in relation to the bill currently before the Parliament, the Better and Fairer Schools Funding and Reform Bill 2024, it has already passed the House of Representatives with the coalition's support. So it's absolutely disgraceful that this Labor government has become so desperate to mislead Australians, Deputy President, that it's now prosecuting these falsehoods. And Senator Polley is not the only one, because the member for Corangamite, in a private member's motion in the other place, also did the same thing, suggesting that the Liberals, when we were in government, cut billions of dollars from school funding. It's an absolute disgrace. And we are seeing a greater tendency of this government to lie through their teeth, to mislead the Australian people, and now we've just heard it in relation—
Senator, there's a point of order, and I think it's the use of the term lie, so I ask you to withdraw that.
I was referring to the government.
Yeah, but
lying.
It's a collective. There's been a ruling.
And so we are very concerned about the fact that this government continues to spread these falsehoods and misrepresent the situation to all Australians. Because when we were in government, the former coalition government lifted annual schools funding from $13 billion a year to more than $25 billion a year. We nearly doubled annual school funding. And so it is a complete embarrassment that Senator Polley, obviously using talking points given to her by the Minister for Education's office, is now trying to prosecute this line. So I want to put on the record a couple of really important corrections in response to Senator Polley's contribution. Time is running out, because while there is a national school reform agreement, and there has been agreements settled with a number of the states and then most recently the ACT, there is still no national reform agreement with New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria and South Australia. So there is no funding deal with those states, and these agreements run out in a matter of weeks on the 31st of December of this year. And what's really concerning is that there are no national school reforms that Mr Clare promised to ensure every child reaches his or her best potential. So we have seen a full-blown school funding war, and we know it's a war because on the 21st of August this year, Labor education ministers from the states and the ACT came to Canberra and they protested against the Albanese government. And the Victorian Education Minister, Ben Carroll, even declared on ABC Radio that morning that the Liberals did a better job funding public schools when in power than the current government. So that is very telling, being called out by your own side of politics by the Victorian Education Minister. And I have to say it takes a special sort of incompetence for things to get this bad. So we would absolutely demand and call on this government to get on with the job with finalising these agreements, because we have seen the majority now of public schools, government schools, which deserve funding certainty, they are being put in limbo. And in fact, Senator Polly speaks about 1 in 10 below the minimum proficiency standards. It's in fact 1 in 3 students who are effectively failing NAPLAN. So there is nothing better or fairer about failing to deliver the national school reforms which are critical to ensuring every child can reach his or her best potential. And so we do acknowledge that there are a number of important reforms in the draft agreement which have been settled by some of the states and also the ACT and the Northern Territory, including evidence-based teaching interventions, screening tests, such as the Year 1 phonics and numeracy check, and improved student attendance and performance targets. But unfortunately, these reforms are both light on detail and they are inadequate. Evidence-based teaching methods such as explicit instruction must be mandated in every classroom. Now, we're starting to see this happen in some states, but this needs to happen in every classroom. The draft agreement says nothing about the need to further improve the national curriculum or deliver crucial reforms to combat classroom disruption, such as a national behaviour curriculum, which was recommended by the Senate inquiry into classroom disruption, very ably chaired by Senator O'Sullivan, because Australia has some of the most unruliest classrooms in the world. So we are concerned that while there are some reforms committed to by this government, they do not go far enough. I also just want to place on the record that the Albanese government continues to talk about fully funding government schools, and Senator Polly made another mistake in her contribution, because in fact the Commonwealth, under the current legislative requirement, does in fact fully fund all public schools. And the only state or territory meeting its requirements currently is the ACT. The Northern Territory is at a dire 59%, and every other state is behind as well, with Queensland's schooling resource standard contribution to government schools just 69% and Victoria at 70%. So this shortfall is not as a responsibility of the Commonwealth under the current agreement. It is by reason of the shortfall from the states. But let's get to the nub of this, because we know that it's not just how much money goes into government schools, into all schools, it's what happens in the classroom. And regrettably, through no fault of teachers and other educators, Australian students are not getting the education they deserve, and as I mentioned, students are failing dramatically in NAPLAN, and we've also seen in the OECD-run Program for International Student Assessment that the average Year 10 Australian student is 1 year behind in his or her learning compared to 20 years ago. And what we do know, and the Australian Education Research Organisation does an incredible job researching evidence-based teaching, that once children fall behind, only 1 in 5 catch up. So the consequences of not learning, with teachers getting the best resources to teach and excel in the classroom, is that this can have a lifetime consequence. And failure to teach children to read and write, the fundamentals of education, also fuels disengagement, dysfunction and even youth crime. And that was very much the finding of the National Children's Commissioner, Anne Hollins, who warned that unless schools do more to help struggling students, things will go from bad to worse. And she said, in fact, the fact that kids have to wait to be in prison to get one-on-one intensive learning support that they need is just abominable. So there is much more to be done. There is much to be done on combating classroom disruption, and so to that extent this national reform agreement is very disappointing. There is much to be done in terms of fixing the national curriculum, and we heard, in fact, the Senate inquiry into this bill. The Australian Government Primary Principals Association called out the national curriculum, saying it was impossible to teach and teachers needed a simpler curriculum to focus on literacy and numeracy. So it is disappointing that, number one, we have not seen this agreement finalised. There's so much smoke and mirrors from the government. And secondly, we're not seeing all the reforms addressed that need to be addressed. Thank you very much.